Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about the books I read in May 2020. May as a reading month wasn't quite as prolific as April was, but that's not all that surprising considering I dedicated a good amount of my free time to helping out at my favorite local used bookstore while they were closed. But now the store is back open. Very happy to announce that. And then, as I am sure you've been seeing either online or in the news, regardless of where you live, there is a movement going on in the United States right now in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I, like so many other people, was horrified watching that video, and it brings to mind the names of countless other Black Americans who have had their lives taken unjustly by police officers, including one here in Pittsburgh in 2018. His name was Antwon Rose, and he was an unarmed 17-year-old. When people really started talking about George Floyd's death online and started talking about the larger issues, I was unfortunately a little bit behind the eight ball. We found out about a family tragedy on the exact same day of the murder. And so I was taking a little bit of space from social media, but since I've been back and engaging more with social media, I have been reading a number of articles, I've been watching videos, supporting causes, doing anything I can do. I will put links down in my description box below to some of the things I've been engaging with over the past week or so, not as any kind of scorekeeping, but in the hopes that they prove helpful in case you're looking for additional ways to become involved, to be active in this movement, or if you're looking for an entry point. White Americans, including myself, have a real part to play in all of this, and we as readers here in this community have the opportunity to read about these issues, to read about the past, present, and future of our country, and use that knowledge to inform the way we act, the way we treat others, the way we think, and more importantly, the way we vote. I know this is different than the normal intro for my wrap-ups. I've only ever done another intro like this after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting here in Pittsburgh in 2018. There are moments when Booktube is perfect for escapism, when it's really nice to be able to go into a Booktube video and ignore the grander problems of the world. But then there are moments like these, when we need to be speaking up and talking about these issues, educating ourselves on these issues because we have the opportunity to change things. We need to be talking about these issues because we cannot change what we do not acknowledge. We first need to acknowledge that these problems exist. They don't go away because they are uncomfortable to face. We need to speak up. We need to talk about these problems. We need to educate ourselves on the structural roots of these issues. And then each of us needs to play a part in making these changes because a more equal country is a better country, period. I know you came here to hear me talk about the books I read in May, so let's do that. At the beginning of the month, I finished off the Reluctant Royal series by Alyssa Cole. I started off by reading the two novellas in the series. The first one is called Once Ghosted, Twice Shy, and the second is called Can't Escape Love. Once Ghosted, Twice Shy takes place partially during the events of the first book and then partially after the events of the first book, and Can't Escape Love happens pretty much exclusively during the events of the second book. So if you're going to be taking on this series and you want to read the novellas, I very much recommend you read them immediately after the book that they complement. In general, I enjoyed both of these fairly equally, but I'm just not sure I'm in love with the idea of a romance novella. In a romance novel, things already move fairly quickly, and in a novella, things move even more quickly because it's shorter. So while this was fun, it was nice to be able to spend some more time with the side characters, and it was nice to complete the series as a whole. I'm not sure they're my favorite. I like the third and final book in the series a whole lot better. That's A Prince on Paper. This is the one and only book in the series where both of the romantic leads are characters that we've met in previous books. We first met Naya in the first book, and we first met Johan in the second book. In this third book, Johan, who is a well-known Playboy prince, needs to drum up some good publicity ahead of a vote that his country faces about whether or not they want to keep around the monarchy. He is not in line for the throne, but his little brother is, and he is well practiced in the arts of looking out for his little brother's best interests. He crosses paths with Naya, who is a friend of his friends. They've always had a bit of an acrimonious relationship, but they've always been attracted to each other, and the two decide to enter into a fake engagement as a publicity stunt. Of course, as time goes on, they start to question how much of the show they're putting on is fake, but how much of it might be real. I really enjoyed this book. It's definitely the sweetest one out of all three, probably because Naya is so inexperienced, though she is not naive. I do have to say though, I think my favorite book in the series is still the second book, A Duke by Default. I know that's kind of an unpopular opinion, but I think there's just so much good character growth in that book. I am really sad this series is over, but I did see that some of the characters from a portion of this third book in the series are going to be in the first book of a brand new series from Melissa Cole called the Runaway Royals series. It looks like that first book is due to come out at the end of this year. Cannot wait. And then I spent one early morning when I just absolutely could not sleep reading My Friend Fear by Miralee Patel. This is a really beautiful little book full of the author's watercolor illustrations that are accompanied by her writings on the concept of fear, what it is and how she learned to control it so that it wouldn't control her. It's a really lovely little book. It was so comforting spending time with this book in those early hours of the morning. I will probably always associate this book with the early hours of the morning now, but I'm not entirely sure it would be memorable otherwise. Don't get me wrong, it's really nice to page through this book to experience both the art and the writing. It's just not something I'm positive I would have bought if I knew how little text there actually was in here. Then I read a pair of nonfiction books that actually married together quite well. The first of those was Lurking by Joanne McNeill, which is a history of how online communities developed. The author uses her own experiences of becoming a user of various sites, including social media sites, to frame a larger discussion of what it means to become a user online, what it means for our personhood when we put ourselves into these online spaces. I think if that kind of brainy look at what we're all doing here online appeals to you, then it will be highly worth your time to pick this book up. I thought it was extremely interesting, and I thought it was especially interesting because I was reading it around the same time I was reading Bowling Alone by Robert D. Putnam. This was one of the books off of my books that have been on my TBR the longest list. This is an extremely data-heavy book looking at what Putnam believes was the decline in civic participation over the course of the 20th century. So basically, he believes that people used to be very engaged, very involved in their communities, but over the course of the century, that stopped being so much the case. I had some real problems with a lot of the arguments in this book. First and foremost, it feels like he's suggesting that there was a peak of civic participation, maybe somewhere in the 50s or 60s, and then everything has just been on a downward trend ever since. There is so much of this book that just reeks of, well, back in my day. And the language he chooses to use is just catastrophizing the data that he's presenting. He actually uses the word extinction, as though we're all at risk of never speaking to one another again if the data continues to trend downward. There's no one point in this book that I really felt he stopped to acknowledge, maybe what I'm seeing in the data is just societal change. Whether you're a student of history or not, you're probably aware that there were some changes that happened in the 20th century. And if your yardstick for civic participation is bored housewives attending social clubs, and those women went to work during World War II and stayed at work following World War II, then yeah, you're going to see a decline in the data, and it doesn't necessarily imply something insidious. This book was published in 2000, right before the internet started changing pretty much everything about the world, and it was kind of funny reading this after reading Lurking, knowing how much the internet has connected all of us. I don't agree with his points in this book really at all. I was seeing a much different story being told in the data than he was. But then again, I have the gift of knowing how the 21st century has been going so far, so I can't really blame him for that. But still, I think if you're interested in the points he makes in this book, you're far better off reading a summary. Then I unfortunately read yet another disappointing book off of the books that have been on my TBR the longest list. That was Enduring Love by Ian McEwan. This book is about the aftermath of a hot air balloon accident that we see right at the beginning of the book. A group of strangers comes together to try to prevent one tragedy from occurring, but then ends up experiencing an entirely different tragedy, which connects them all going forward. One of the people involved ends up getting frighteningly attached to our main character. I don't have much to say about this one because I very blandly just didn't like it. It didn't make me angry. It didn't even necessarily bore me. I just didn't like it. I think one of his later books, Saturday, does a very similar kind of thing in terms of the types of the characters and the tense story, but it does it much better. Another project book I read during the month of May was In the Sanctuary of Outcasts by Neil White. This was the book off of my 5-star nonfiction predictions list that I read for the month. This is the memoir of a man who served time for bank fraud at a prison that doubled as a home for people afflicted with leprosy. Neil White ran several different magazines throughout the 80s and 90s, and he began using check kiting as a way to get himself capital. If you've never heard of check kiting, it's essentially taking advantage of the inherent delay in a bank transfer. It takes 2 or 3 days to transfer money from one bank to another. So when you transfer money over that's not really there, it'll take a couple of days for the banks to realize that you've done that. So it can be used to buy yourself time or give yourself money that you don't really have. As you can imagine, it's highly illegal. He ended up serving a year's time at this prison in Carville, Louisiana, during which time he lived amongst leprosy patients. He does give details about the patients, most of whom go by pseudonyms, and their disease, but during this time that he served, he admits that he saw himself not as a prisoner, but as an investigative reporter. So during this time, he did research on the prison, he did research into leprosy, he interviewed his fellow prisoners as well as the patients, and he does also tell his own story, but it is kind of like he was outside of himself. From what I read in this book, considering he did write it so many years after he served his time, it seems as though he's critical of that initial stance he took, that it was almost as though he was trying to escape responsibility by not seeing himself as just another prisoner. He does show a great deal of remorse in this book, though. He knows what he did was wrong. He knows how much it affected so many other people in his life, and he takes culpability for it, so that was good. He does eventually develop really good relationships, really good friendships with the leprosy patients, but it was really hard reading about how he initially talked about them and treated them before he got to know them, and additionally how the other prisoners talk about them and treat them. Leprosy is one of the world's earliest, one of the world's oldest prejudices. It's written about in the Bible. Fear of it causes anyone who actually comes down with the still very mysterious disease to be isolated and shunned. Even the word leper has become synonymous with the word outcast. And because the patients in this book, even back in the 90s, really didn't appreciate being called that, I'm now removing that word from my vocabulary. This was a very interesting book. It's not quite at the level of a 5-star read, but a solid 4. Also, as part of my ongoing efforts to understand the global pandemic situation that we're unfortunately still dealing with, I picked up On Immunity by Eula Biss. This is a work of nonfiction that looks at different sides of public health and immunization. It's essentially a series of long-form essays that consider things like personal responsibility when we're talking about the grander health of society, the push against vaccines that we've been seeing in recent years, and also different topics relating back to immunity in some kind of a way. Throughout, the author uses her own experience as a mother to guide these discussions. I thought everything in here was very interesting food for thoughts. I think, like Lurking, the book I was discussing before about online communities, if you're looking for a brainy book that will get your wheels turning about some very relevant current issues, this might be for you. But if you're looking for a book that discusses the immune system in any kind of very strict scientific sense, this probably won't be what you're looking for. Now let me tell you about the books I read for Springathon, which was a 2-week-long nature writing readathon hosted by Natalie from Curious Reader and Emma from A Cup of Books. I wore my dinosaur dress especially for Emma today. I actually started working at the bookstore while this readathon was still going on, so I didn't end up having quite as much free time to read as I thought I would have. So I went ahead and extended this to become a month-long reading initiative as opposed to just those 2 weeks. So let me first start off by talking about my favorite book I read for the readathon, which also doubled as my favorite book of the month. That was The Salt Path by Rainer Wynn. This ended up being one of those backlist books that just really had a moment here on BookTube. It seems like everyone was reading this for Springathon. This is a memoir. It tells the story of how the author and her husband, fresh off of losing their home and finding out that her husband was terminally ill, decided to walk the Southwest Coast Path in the UK. Or really, they were kind of forced into that decision because they were homeless. This book is really a play-by-play of that walk, what and who they encountered, how they stretched their very limited amount of money, how hard it was on their bodies, but also the freedom and the grit it gave them. This book is both emotionally powerful and incredibly entertaining. I loved pretty much everything about this book. Highly recommend. And then I also very quickly read Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a book all about mosses, and it's written by the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, in case you've heard of that book. One of my very lovely commenters told me that they had read this book alongside The Signature of All Things because the main character in that book studies mosses. I decided to follow their lead since I very recently read and reviewed The Signature of All Things, and I am so glad I did so. This is a really wonderful little book. The author has this way way of just making you feel surrounded by the natural worlds. This whole book is full of wonder. It is also so gentle and so comforting. I really enjoyed it, and now I cannot wait to read Braiding Sweetgrass. Then I read an ARC that was kindly sent to me by Icon Books. That ARC was of Liquid Gold by Roger Morgan Grenville. This is another memoir all about how the author in his middle age got into beekeeping. I would say he stumbled into the hobby, but we're talking about stinging insects, and that sounds painful. This was a really quick read, but it was a lot of fun. I learned so much about beekeeping. I've always been very interested to learn how all of that works, especially considering my stepfather was very interested in getting into the hobby for a period of time. But I think the best thing about this book is the writing. He is so funny. He has such a great sense of humor. I was laughing pretty much every other page. He did repeat points from the introduction throughout the book, which I didn't think was entirely necessary. And I also have to say that I really don't like this cover. I don't know if these shadow effects look better on the finished hardcover, but here on the ARC, it just looks like a mishmash of clip art, and I'm not a big fan of it. But besides those nitpicky points, this was highly enjoyable. Definitely recommend this one as well. I also finally finished Late Migrations by Margaret Rankel. This is another memoir nature writing combo, but it's told in very powerful, very beautifully written vignettes. All of them are absolutely gorgeous, but especially the last two. If you like your books more on the literary side and you also like memoir or nature writing, I think this one will be directly up your alley. And then finally, the last three books I'd like to talk to you about in this wrap up are books that I have talked about elsewhere, so I'll only briefly mention them here. The first of those three is The Bird Way by Jennifer Ackerman. This book is by the author of the very popular The Genius of Birds, but this book is all about the world that birds experience. As the author says, there's the mammal way of doing things, and then there's the bird way. Well, this book is all about the bird way, and it is chock full of interesting facts, stories, and studies about a variety of different bird species. I liked this one even more than I liked The Genius of Birds. If you'd like to hear more about this book, I wrote a full review of it for Open Letters Review, and I will put a link to that review in the description box below. I also read The Book of Eels by Patrick Svensson, a book all about the mysterious creature, or really a book about how much we still don't know about eels, mixed in with the author's childhood stories of fishing for eel with his father. I liked the memoir sections. I thought they were very authentic and heartfelt, but the portions where he's examining the science in this book read like a freshman philosophy paper, and overall, I thought it was pretty stupid. If you'd like to see me rip this book apart using my words, I will link my review I did for Open Letters Review down in the description box below. And finally, I read Silvia Marner by George Eliot, the tale of a socially isolated weaver whose entire life is changed when a little girl wanders into his home and he adopts her. It is a highly moral work that sends a clear message that material wealth is nothing if you don't have good people to spend your life with. I did enjoy it, though not nearly as much as Middlemarch, but I do think it would be a good entry point for anyone looking to get into Eliot's work. Not only is it her shortest book, but it also will give you a really good sense of her writing style. Because this book is so morally focused, though, it made a great choice for a Wishbone adaptation, which I talk about in my latest installment of What's the Story, Wishbone. I think it's one of the most successful episodes of Wishbone I've seen thus far, for a few different reasons. If you'd like to hear more about that, I will link that latest installment of What's the Story, Wishbone, both in the description box below and up in the cards for you. So those were all the books I read during the month of May. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books, if you've heard of any of these books, or if you're now interested in picking them up after hearing me discuss them. You can put that or any other comments or questions you may have down in the comment section below, but if you'd prefer to find me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you are having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.